They continue to gather, to protest, to demand. There is no sense 12 days in, the anger here is dying away.
Mubarak ought to leave. Mubarak ought to let us live freedom.
You know, all the people here didn't need Mubarak anymore.
The crowd wanted Friday's protest to be decisive, to be President Mubarak's day of departure. He's still there and getting on with business. This was a meeting with senior cabinet members in Cairo. But pressure is growing. Speaking in Germany, US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton says the Middle East is facing a perfect storm of circumstances and changes have to follow.
The status quo is simply not sustainable. So for all our friends, for all the friends in the region, including governments and people, the challenge is to help our partners take systematic steps to usher in a better future.
Speaking on Egyptian state TV, the Prime Minister says things are slowly returning to normal.
I mean, for every day that goes, stability returns and we are more hopeful. We no longer see the events happening like last Friday, and security forces are gradually returning. Today you don't hear about more clashes, which shows that generally things are getting better. The opposition itself is very divided, but this doesn't mean that we won't talk to all parties. In the end, the main thrust of their demands is the same.
One of those groups in the square, the Muslim Brotherhood, says the agenda has always been clear.
This revolution is the people's revolution, and it is not a religious revolution. We want a civilian state from the will of the people and not religion.
The army has been asking the protesters to remove the barricades with the promise the square will be protected. For the moment, the barricades remain, and so do the people. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera.
Let's go back to Liberation Square, bring in another of our correspondents. What can you tell us?
Well, what we can see really is that the army is trying to get the edges of the square back to normal. I think very much the message that the army is sending to the protesters is that it's over. We've seen a crane came in to remove some of the burnt-out vehicles that had been used as defensive barricades in the street battles on Wednesday and Thursday. We've seen flatbed trucks coming in to move stuff, and we've seen a whole army of municipal workers wearing high-vis jackets, sweeping up, clearing up. Now, the barricade to the side of the Egyptian Museum is still there, and that the protesters are very much hanging on to that. But the scene that we're seeing on the street is very much mirroring, is very much echoing the kind of impression that President Mubarak is trying to give by holding cabinet meetings, and that is on the streets as well as in the government offices. The authorities are telling the world and telling the people of Cairo that it's back to business as normal.
When in fact it is anything but, and if you have to have the head of Central Command, a general I've now been told is Hassan El-Rawini, not the general that I mentioned earlier on, but the head of Central Command, Hassan El-Rawini, who's gone into the square and effectively been told by the protesters, we don't need you here. It is anything but business is normal.
This is an impression that the authorities and that President Mubarak has been trying to maintain throughout. You'll remember those pictures of him on Tuesday, the day of one of the biggest demonstrations, swearing in his new cabinet. You've got hundreds of thousands of people converging on Tahrir Square. You've got President Mubarak trying to keep up this decorum, this protocol of state. But I have to tell you that on the ground around the square, the protesters in the square and the hardcore, clearly for them, they have no intention of giving up their positions, and they certainly would not give way to the extensive demands. The army was on the ground at this barricade for hours earlier in the day on Saturday. The protesters did not give up. What we're seeing, David, I think, is really like a staring contest. The question is who is going to blink first. And up until now, President Mubarak's eyelids are not shifting.
We've said since the start of this that the position of the army is absolutely crucial in everything that happens. It's respected by the people. It holds a particular place in society that allows it to, if not control events, then certainly influence events hugely. So what we're seeing from the army now, if it is a change in position, is potentially significant.
It is significant. I think that the army is having to walk a very fine line, because we did hear those public pledges, not once but several times, from the army that it would not use force against the demonstrators. And I think we've seen that fulfilled today, both by the appearance of this very senior official in the square to try to talk to people, and the scenes that I've witnessed. Dozens of soldiers standing, talking to the protesters at the barricade, but the protesters forming human chains, linking hands and refusing to give in, and then the army going away. So the army is not using force against the protesters, but the army is clearly under orders to get the streets open, get the streets back to normal, and it's trying to do that in a way that's as unconfrontational as possible, but it is nevertheless trying to get the streets clear, trying to remove barricades. So it quite clearly is under orders, and the orders it's following are the orders of the authorities.
The difficulty, though, is if the army is met with resistance, and it said it wouldn't use force against peaceful protesters, it's how you interpret peaceful protests.
That is the big question. But in fact, President Mubarak has another factor mitigating in his favour at the moment, and that is the weather. It's become very cloudy and damp. There's been rain in the air as well. It's not an environment to encourage the morale of people who are planning to sleep on the square overnight. Obviously, this is not a factor that can easily be controlled, but it has to be playing in President Mubarak's advantage at the moment. But with regard to the army itself, so far it hasn't been put to the test. But I think it's going to avoid at all costs anything in terms of physical confrontation, which means that this standoff, this staring contest in Tahrir Square could go on for quite some time yet.
Thank you very much for that. Another one of our team is on the line. Now, you've been talking to some of the protesters, finding out what they make of the appearance of General Hassan El-Rawini, head of Central Command, and the fact that he asked them to clear away from the square. What have they told you?
Well, they simply said that they refused to leave the square until their demand of President Mubarak's departure is met. They said that they are aware that time is running out for them as well in a certain way, but they will not leave. I mean, it was an incredible scene. He walked across the square surrounded by his security details, as far as I can say, and he was really followed by a trail of hundreds of protesters chanting, "We will not leave, we will not leave, we will not leave." And then they were stopped just as he exited the square from the opposite side.
Was there ever any danger of a serious confrontation taking place between, admittedly, a high-ranking officer, but a man with very few soldiers around him in the midst of a crowd that clearly didn't want to listen to what he had to say?
Well, to be honest, I don't think so, because the role of the army has been quite appreciated here, especially on Liberation Square. They have always had quite friendly dealings with the supporters. They have never really interfered, and lately when when infiltrators, as they call them, actually supporters of the Mubarak regime came into the square, those were, the army were the ones helping the pro-democracy supporters, in the sense that they were always handed over to them. So I don't think anyone would have actually sort of wanted to attack him in any shape or form, because they were also chanting as he was walking, the army and the people are together, the army and the people are unified. So I don't think anyone on the square would have crossed really that limit.
Give our audience an idea of where the army normally sits in Egyptian society, what kind of regard it's held in by the people, and what kind of control the government has over it, or whether it is, in fact, an independent body to some extent.
Well, the army in Egypt is very highly regarded. It usually has very little dealings with the public. The army is really, for Egyptians, the symbol of Egypt's victory in 1973 during the Israeli war. The army is the one that protected the borders of Egypt, but the army is also the entity that provided every single leader and president that Egypt had since the revolution in 1952. It is a very, very strong institution. It is acknowledged by everybody that the army is actually hand in hand with the presidency, but it's also a very strong power. It owns a lot of land, it owns a lot of business and taxes, it employs a lot of people, and that is really